journalist, political commentator Vitaly Portnikov is in direct contact with us. Vitaly, hello. Hello. Before meeting you today, I reread an essay by Václav Havel, the last president of Czechoslovakia and the first president. The president of the Czech Republic is powerless. This USSR was written in 1978. And to simplify it, the idea there is that the whole power of dictatorial regimes, these authoritarian models, rests on the fact that society adapts, that society simply accepts. These are the rules of the game. Today, I sometimes have the same feeling that society in a global sense is beginning to adjust. That is, it is the same power of the powerless. But if people just don't want to put up with it, even not very aggressively, without using some kind of force, then nothing. This will not happen, but we observe this right of the strong precisely on the basis of the essay that Havel wrote in 1978. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe it's an illusion and a trap that you sometimes fall into when you read something that has been written for a long time. And look at today. How much do you think actually have all these systems that we are now seeing, holding on to the impotence of the society? And this is making these rules. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney began his speech at the international conference with a quote from Václav Havel, the People's Economic Forum in Davos. And everyone quotes him and calls him a historical performance. But I think it's not so much because of Havel's quote, but because of the attempts of the Prime Minister of Canada, in fact, to outline a new world order. Or, if you like, a new world disorder. So I, in turn, wrote some time ago, I think, at the beginning of the year, my own essay called Chaos, in which I said that the biggest problem of the modern world is chaoticness. His existence. This is also said by the Prime Minister of Canada. And this is what two people have appeared, ready to break the rules and ready to change the world order. It's really very hard to adjust to this. The first of these was the President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin. The second was the President of the United States, Donald Trump. We see that he enjoys breaking the established rules in the world. And this is really a very big problem. Therefore, of course, in order to adapt to this situation, it is very important to call a spade a spade. But at the same time, I would underestimate the dangers. When Václav Havel wrote his CC force is powerless, he relied on the mood in a socialist society, the so-called, in which Michael Carney never lived, and in which we lived with you by and large. Are you less time you lived in a post-socialist society? Basically, I lived in such a completely, I would say, real society, Soviet, almost until I was 20, in fact, until I was 19. Mark Carney has not lived in anything like this, and therefore he can take Václav Havel at his word. I just think that Václav Havel proceeded from his own idea of the state of society, which is very often among people who challenge an authoritarian system, not that it is illusory, but it is based on their sincere, the desire to change the rules of the game for decent people. Because when Václav Havel wrote this essay, when he lived most of his life, he was in an absolute minority in the society in which he lived. And then we need to understand that this state of any society in an authoritarian regime. There are three categories of the population. One category of the population supports the regime and considers it possible to make a career, or even believes in some ideas of this regime, especially at the first stage. The second category of people actively struggles with what is happening. And the third category of people is absolutely indifferent to what is happening and tries to live their own lives, not paying attention to politics. And the strength of authoritarian regimes, of course, is in this central category of the population, which is not interested in politics at all. But at the same time, you always need to think about what the base of the regime is. Those who are ready to support it, maybe not even going to defend him, but, in principle, share its values and its ideological tenets. There were a lot of such people in the communist world. People who were not ready to take to the streets in order to defend the communist regime, but who, in principle, agreed that it was the right one. And it was this number of people that predetermined the descent of attempts to establish democracy in Russia to the Putin regime. The regime's base was very large. Well, by the way, the same can be said about Czechoslovakia in the past. Excuse me if Václav Havel was right about the grocer, which hangs in the window of the communist slogan, not really believes in it. Where would Robert Fico have come from in Slovakia, and Andrej Babiš in the Czech Republic? How would Václav Klaus, and then Miloš Zeman, become Václav Havel's successor as president of the Czech Republic? Do you even remember that? Of course, relationships. Well, the current president of the Czech Republic, Petr Pavel, is just such the success of those who adhere to democratic attitudes in society. But, as you can see, they are by no means always in the majority. That is, by and large, Ulavgev simply did not understand the society in which he lives. And it needs to be recognized. Because if I understood, everything would be different, it would develop differently. Yes, there has always been a large number of people in this society who adhere to democratic and, most importantly, anti-colonial views of people who were against the occupation of Czechoslovakia, the invasion itself. The Soviet Union in Czechoslovakia increased the number of these people at the expense of those who used to believe in the Soviet Union recklessly. Because I want to remind you that Czechoslovakia was occupied when the Communist Party was in power there. Thinking about some pseudo-reforms that in the Soviet Union itself under Gorbachev ended in the collapse of the Communist Party mode. And in Czechoslovakia they would have ended in collapse. This must also be understood when we say that the Soviet Union attacked Czechoslovakia not justifiably, but justifiably from the point of view of the Brezhnev campaign, because they understood that any reforms of socialism lead to the collapse of socialism. And then it was checked, their inheritance, in Moscow. So they just held on to their dictatorship and did not want to give any successful examples to those who want to get rid of this dictatorship. By the way, this largely explains Putin's attack on Ukraine. This is not only a territorial acquisition, it is an unwillingness to see success. Russians consider Ukrainians to be practically the same Russians in Europe. Russian chauvinism, it turns out that Russians can flourish in Europe, even if they call themselves Ukrainians. And we have to be here outside of Europe to miss out. Well, it is clear that such a Ukraine just needs to be turned into the ashes, are absolutely logical from Putin's point of view. As an attack on Czechoslovakia was logical from Brezhnev's point of view. It turns out that this is such a bridge, so I'm sorry to interrupt. In other words, the suppression of the Prague Spring and what happened in Ukraine is already a large-scale war, full-scale. These are all links. One chain, one understanding. Of course, this is Russia's desire to be the gendarme of Europe, or if you want, wider than Eurasia. To prevent the successful development of the situation in any of the countries that are in Moscow's sphere of influence. Well, I repeat again, there are a lot more people who supported this than I thought. What were the dissidents thinking in the countries of Central Europe or in the post-Soviet space? Bitter disappointment and defeat of their basic life principles awaited all these people. They achieved success, they achieved the fact that their countries were leaving the Soviet connection, influence, and then the voters of these countries absolutely honestly, freely voted for people who were against all their principles, and turned them into real marginals. You know, the most beautiful example that I give is when after a victory, Vladimir Zelensky, in the presidential elections of Ukraine, a deputy of the Verkhovna Rada of the first convocation came to the Ukrainian parliament, which was the convocation that announced independence of Ukraine, Stepan Kmara. And he spoke together with one of the other deputies, in my opinion, the former prosecutor general Shishkin, if I'm not mistaken, who was in this first convocation. Stepan Kmara himself could not participate in the vote for independence, that he, I'm sorry, was in prison. On this day, August 24, 1991, in prison. He was put there as a radical because he committed the wrong actions there in support of Ukrainian independence at one of the rallies. He was credited with a collision with a police officer there. But it's not about the biography of Stepan Kmar, but the fact that Stepan Kmar, all his life, he fought for the independence of Ukraine, was in camps, was in prisons. was arrested even in August 1991, comes to a solemn meeting, speaks and calls the new government servants of the people, liquidators of Ukraine. And the funny thing is that the people who are sitting in the hall, they don't even know who he is, because they have never been interested in all these years of Ukrainian history. The head of the parliamentary faction of the Servants of the People, David Rakimia, disparagingly calls Khmar and his associates grandfathers of mopeds, so he doesn't even understand what kind of people they are in front of him. Do you understand? Absolute deafening, 100% defeat. 73% of Ukrainian voters in the presidential elections, about the same, slightly less, in the parliamentary elections. Vote for people who despise those who fought for the independence of Ukraine, absolutely openly. I think that David has long overestimated these statements of his against the background of the war for the destruction of Ukraine, which he is now observing and in which he participates as the head of the parliamentary faction. But we are not talking now about what kind of reassessment Vladimir Zelensky and his colleague had at the moment, when they were faced with the possibility of their own physical destruction at any moment of this war, realizing that the death lists are already signed in the office of Russian President Vladimir Putin. We're talking about voters, not politicians. And the same goes for all these societies. The Czech Republic, with Klaus Zeman Babiš. Slovakia, with Vladimir Michiar and Robert Fitz. The most terrible symbol is when the chairman of the Federal Assembly of Czechoslovakia and the former first secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia during the Prague Spring, Alexander Dubček, dies. Practically, he is already on the threshold of his election, possibly as president of an independent Slovakia. I can cite a huge number of such examples. Therefore, one should not underestimate people's support from authoritarianism and assume that authoritarianism is kept simple, because some honest people don't want to go out on the streets to fight him. No, authoritarianism holds because it has a huge base of public support. And by the way, this database, Vadim, is expanding thanks to information technology. Because people who are now participating as voters in electoral cycles, they are looking for simple answers to complex questions. And nothing new is happening now, as Mark Carney said, at all. We're just going back 100 years ago, when society had a conditional choice between Adolf Hitler and Ernst Thälmann. When the German workers did not know who to rush to, Hitler or Thälmann. But now it's almost the same situation. The far right, which in turn, the reaction of the ultra-left is being caused all over the world, and people freely vote for it. Have you seen the results of the first round of the Portuguese presidential election? Yes, I saw it. There has been a lot of writing about this now on social networks, just the same. It's generally awesome to get through. 5 decades after the overthrow of the dictatorship of Salazar Caetan, a huge number of Portuguese people vote for the far-right politician André Ventura, who goes to the second round. But the most terrible thing is not that Ventura goes through to the second round, and the fact that adherents of right-wing conservative views, people whom I have always considered my allies in maintaining democracy. Do you understand? If I am a liberal, then my ally is a conservative, of course, a moderate socialist, but also a conservative. For me, all these people in the same boat, because we want democracy to fight for our vision of any country within the framework of a democratic regime. So, these people, in fact, do not support the rival Ventura, because he is a socialist in his views. This is exactly the same thing that happened in Germany in the 30s, when the German conservatives decided that Hitler was better than an alliance with the Social Democrats. The Social Democrats did not want to deal with the conservatives and sought alliances with the communists. And we say all the time, oh, what a pity that the German Social Democrats did not unite with the communists. They would have stopped Hitler. Why the fuck were they supposed to unite with the communists, excuse me? They could unite with the conservatives, with the Christian Democrats in the future, and stop both Hitler and Thälmann. They didn't do it. Here we are exactly approaching this. Do you understand? When the conservatives and, let's just say, the moderate right is ready to unite with the ultra-right only to prevent those whom they call leftists from coming to power there. And as a result, this is the case everywhere. Already some of the right-wing conservatives support Marine Le Pen and the brothel. And the left, as you have noticed in France, unite with the far-left Mélenchon in order to maintain their place in political life. Although, in fact, there should have been a completely different association. Supporters of the Socialists, Republicans, French, Gallists and Macron would have to create a united front to weed out and Mélenchon and Le Pen forever. But they don't. Exactly the same kind of perception of reality led France to surrender to Hitler's Germany. Excuse me. I would like to remind you, when there was a popular front of socialists and communists, but it was ineffective for obvious reasons. But everything is different. The right was more afraid of socialists and communists than Hitler in France. And so we breathed a sigh of relief when it appeared. Therefore, all that we see, Vadim, is just poorly learned history lessons, when after 50 years. People are not afraid of the ruins of death, but they are not afraid in vain. This is a technological moment, because, if I'm not mistaken, Steve Wozniak, one of the creators of Apple, is credited with the following words: "We wanted to make people sighted thanks to our technology, thanks to the smartphone, but we made them blind." He meant something else, that people stopped looking up from the phone, that is, not the political component. But it's just that people began to live more in virtual space. But if we just analyze even the recent past, it seems to me that there was a very disturbing symptom when Brexit happened. When, in general, populists played on this topic, they did not want it to actually happen, but it suddenly happened. And this has already triggered that mechanism, the inclusion of people from social networks who suddenly found a voice. And the voice is so very loud. And as usually happens, who has faced rudeness, the boor as a rule is always heard louder, because you try to calm him down. But he sprays and goes on and on. And all this acquired a kind of such force that it began to sweep away everything in its path. And this is the result of that policy. The fact that we became blind, began to live in these phones, and got some kind of, let's say, even power in a sense. This has led to what we are talking about now. Do you agree with this? No way. And what about mobile phones in the 30s? But we had quite a long period, as it seems to me, after all, there was no such immunity. And now it's not that this has become the root cause, but it has given a new step. A chance for these people to rise again. I think it has nothing to do with scientific and technological progress. Scientific and technological progress, on the contrary, having weapons of mass destruction in its hands, may be stopping a big war that otherwise would have started long ago. Only the fear of war matters. Yes, of course, technological progress helps. People are looking for these simple answers to complex questions right in their phones. And in the 30s, he helped to look for simple answers to complex questions on the radio, which also then became an information novelty. You remember how in all the old movies or films about the 30-20s of the last century people stick to radios, remember? Well, of course, it was Goebbels' idea, if I'm not mistaken, so that every household had its own radio. Well, that's right, so how does Goebbels differ from Musk? Well, it's just that Goebbels had a radio, Musk had a Twitter account, with which he helped Trump win. But it's all the same. It has nothing to do with progress. It's just that there is a new technology, but the people have remained the same. They just lost their fear. Fear necessarily disappears after 50 years. Because people who give simple answers to complex questions, they are. As a rule, if the population is led into a quagmire, then after great suffering, death, a large number of people, and other unpleasant events, it becomes disillusioned with politics again and simply ceases to trust. This tool, let's say, the policy remains responsible. But for this, a person who comes now, I would say, to the polling station, being a person of a child's political consciousness, must, like a child, bake himself several times on fire, yes, perhaps with terrible suffering and tragedies. But nothing else happens in history. I can't tell you another recipe for educating a responsible voter because I can say anything. I've been saying anything for years, as you know. Words do not affect a very large number of people. A large number of people are affected only by a catastrophe, which these people themselves arrange for themselves. Do you understand? Poking a burning finger into the tiger's nose right in his cage, let's say, if we talk about history. And you think that the tiger will just run away somewhere and get scared. Because they, by virtue of their own ignorance, do not understand how a tiger differs from an ordinary domestic cat. This is what the world has looked like since antiquity, if you read the ancient dramas that we have left. The inheritance was the same, Nothing new is happening in this world. We just happen to be exactly at this intersection. People who, let's say, left around 2004 to 2005 were sure that the world was very prosperous, right? Yes, I understand that before 2019, although there was already Crimea, there was already Donbass, but before 2019. It's like, in dystopian films or even in disaster films. You remember 2019, I just had a son, so I remember well how such a window, curtain and light. And then there was COVID. And everything starts with COVID. Our familiar world is already beginning to collapse in a global sense. Although it began to crumble. People, apparently, even very big politicians, after they have had COVID or are scared of COVID, are rapidly losing the remnants of reason. There was some kind of rehearsal, that's how there are these horsemen of the apocalypse. Well, it is clear that this is some kind of figure from the mythologized in many ways. But yes, the plague came, and then the war came. And then what? Hunger, death, and so on. And we see that this biblical story of the Old Testament, it is being implemented. You may not believe it, but it just matches up really well. You understand that this world is changing even in a religious sense. You can find some analogies. I say again that this is an ordinary historical process that just needs to be experienced. I'm just very sorry, for example, that Ukrainians are experiencing this process first. And that's why many in Ukraine, especially now, when you see these atrocities of Putin. When he just wants to freeze Ukraine and its big cities, it seems to many in Ukraine that this is the very catastrophe. Because for a person, for his family, for his loved ones, this is a real catastrophe. What suits Russia in our country? But believe me, this catastrophe will be much bigger and much more serious than we think. Great war in Ukraine is only the starting gunshots. The inability to stop this war is only the shots of the starting pistol. The fact that Trump, along with Putin, is ready to break the rules, and Putin with his annexations, is practically an example for Trump. This also says a lot. Therefore, the question always arises here. And even if these powerless people from the USSR, Vaclav, Gavel rise up, what can they seriously change in this situation? It takes time to adapt. Here in Ukraine, as you remember, there was the Maidan of 2013 to 2014. And it seemed to many Maidan participants that they should defeat the Yanukovych regime or, at least, first achieve European integration for Ukraine. How everything will be fine. And when I said, as soon as we defeat Yanukovych, we will face Putin, many thought that I was exaggerating, to put it mildly. And I've been saying that since 2004, by the way. Because I perfectly understood that Yanukovych himself is just, this hand puppet. A puppet. Putin is on his arm. It's not called a puppet, but what is it called? This is a doll that puts on your hand. Yes, I understand what we are talking about, which I think our viewers are talking about. Good question, yes. And I said the same thing to my Belarusian friends in 2020. You can defeat Lukashenko if Lukashenko has an inefficient power apparatus. But Belarus is not Iran. You will face Putin, you will need to defeat Putin. And we're in a very similar situation right now. Mark Arney says that it is necessary not to accept what the American administration is doing. Well, in fact, this is his message. This is the right message, but everything happened very quickly. The United States has so quickly changed its attitude to foreign policy, to partners, to allies. They abandoned the rules that they themselves imposed in the modern world so quickly that it takes time to adapt to this. It can't be done in one day, Can we do without American support in Ukraine today? Figuratively speaking, it will be very difficult. And the United States produces much more weapons than Europe. And intelligence information can be much more important than in Europe. In other words, it's just another fiction. States. And from a security point of view. That's it. And it is clear that Europe can achieve this. I'm not going to underestimate the capabilities of the European Union and Europe as a whole. But it takes time. And if we have this time, here we in Ukraine have the time, and in European countries, it is unknown whether this time you know. After all such things, they are like a tsunami, come unexpectedly. It's as if you understand that there may be an earthquake. It would seem that after Trump's first term, it would be possible to understand everything, right? Well, there were fears when he went for a second term, there were concerns. But I think it's psychology. It was possible after the first time to understand what is happening. After the first one. Do you understand? Get ready. Nobody did it. Joseph Biden was elected, and everyone sighed, everything is calm. America is back. Well, she came back for 4 years, and then she left again. Or maybe she will come back in 4 years, suddenly we will calm down again. Which is not at all obvious that the Euro-Atlantic world is dead. And even if the supporters of the Democrats in the United States win the congressional elections, and even if a Democrat becomes president of the United States again, we cannot calm down. Because the Republican Party itself has changed. In a disastrous way. For Europe, I mean. I'm not going to talk about America's national interests right now. That's the problem. I think it's psychology. That's if from the macro level to the micro level, to the level of an ordinary person. Here we live in Latvia, in the Baltic states. There is constant talk here about whether there will be an attack. Now it's a conversation that dominates. But psychologically, it seems to me that any person turns on, well, maybe not, well, maybe it will pass. Well, let's not panic. You're somehow even on such a personal level. You try to drive away these thoughts from yourself, although everything that develops around shows that there is a threat, it is real. But it's scary to accept, and scary to admit, even on. You will agree that it was exactly the same in Ukraine. Ukraine now, faced with this big war, yes, this is just an example of what to look at. I remember conversations on the eve of February 24th, when people in Ukraine said that there probably won't be. Well, and I understand why, but it's very scary. Accept that this is it. I must tell you that on February 24th, 2022, before the 24th in a few days, I conducted my last big broadcast in the studio. And almost all the experts who would have gathered, they answered my question whether there would be such an invasion, they all answered that there was not. Although I'm on the air before that. He spoke clearly about the consequences of the invasion. And about millions of refugees, and about bombed-out cities. I've told everyone about it. And do you know how one of my colleagues later characterized this story? He said that I was listening to this broadcast of yours when you were telling all this. Sometime after the start of the war, I don't know how many months, maybe even a year. And I thought, my God, you're just Vitaly crazy. Why is he telling all this, all these horror stories? And then he says, there came a day when it became clear that all the madmen were right. But it was understandable, absolutely understandable. You are absolutely right that no one wants to believe this. And now many in Ukraine believe that it is possible to stop the danger, for example, by donating territories. That Putin needs a piece of Donbass. And the American administration believes in it. Well, I'll tell you, if Putin has a very bad economy, he understands that he is nearing collapse. He understands that he is nearing collapse. It's important. He can really stop snatching a piece of territory in order to also destabilize Ukraine with such a political decision. It's all possible. But this will not be the end of the war, it will be a respite before a new, even more serious test. As you understand. Because that kind of consent, just because I don't have it right now. Strength means I will accumulate strength and strike again. And again, then it will be necessary not to calm down, but to do everything possible so that such a blow does not occur. Accumulating resources, creating military factories, strengthening the army at the cost of the interests of people who will say, well, we live terribly, we have. There is no money, we have the opportunity to feed. There is no family, and you are building fortresses again, as if Putin will attack. It was Ma'am, who determined the 2019 election. Otherwise Putin will attack. Everyone laughed about it. The vast majority of Ukrainians laughed out loud at their own tragedy. And the same thing is happening in Europe. Yes, I agree. Donald Trump, he copies Putin because it was predictable. I remember even we said on the same broadcast that they would soon start talking about Greenland being their Crimea. And so it happened. Lavrov said that the US is doing everything right, Greenland, the area of their interests, the Crimea area of interests of Russia. Lavrov said, and Greenland the zone of interests of the United States. In other words, they began to play on this topic. Like, come on, do it, turn on. Here is Trump, when he goes to such an aggravation with NATO, in fact, driving a wedge in general into the North Atlantic Alliance, into the Commonwealth of Western democracies and so on. He somehow voluntarily, unwittingly copies Putin, or is it, in general, his, an autonomous path? Well, you know Hitler's famous legendary phrase that when it was said about the final solution of the Jewish question. Just who remembers the Armenian genocide now, right? Well, it's a very similar situation. And indeed, if Germany had won the Second World War, who would remember the Holocaust now? I'm sorry. Nobody. There are already works in the genre of alternative history, including in cinema. Very good comprehension. This topic is going away. Trump was convinced that there was a very weak reaction of the international community to the annexation of Crimea. The same United States. He wasn't the president, Barack Obama was the president. Barack Obama has done almost nothing. At all. Well, he imposed some kind of lipless sanctions there. And then he said that they have cumulative power. Personal sanctions against some officials. Do you remember what sanctions were imposed on Crimea? Although it was a very obvious violation of international law number 1 after the Second World War. SWIFT was not turned off, then they only talked, but they did not even come close to that. I remember that so. Why didn't they get closer? The real sanctions, Vadim, began to be imposed, and then they were not absolutely obvious. Only after Russia shot down this Malaysian Boeing. Because there were citizens of the European Union there. Yes. And if there had not been this crime, there would not have been these sanctions. And Russia, perhaps, would then feel much more at ease in the Donbas. Therefore, if Trump sees that the world community has swallowed Crimea, why can't he swallow Greenland? Moreover, Greenland will not be like Crimea. There will also be democracy, not repression. Here's the logic for you. Any lack of reaction to a crime generates a willingness to repeat it. How far can Trump go on the Greenland issue? He answered this question himself. See, said Donald Trump. But what do you think? I would hope that European leaders will be able to dissuade the President of the United States from to decisive action in this area. But we are very close to the collapse of the Euro-Atlantic world. And if this happens, then Putin has a free hand, then China can, in general, also do it. I'm not sure. I think there will be completely different consequences, which we can only guess about now. But all this does not bring us closer to the world, as I understand it. It doesn't bring us closer to the world, but it brings us closer to completely different configurations. But to the European Defense Union, where no one will ask whether to accept Ukraine there or not. Do you understand? For example, it will be one of the founders of this union. Together with Great Britain, France, Germany, and other countries. If American bases in Europe disappear, then European ones will appear in Ukraine. Life will be completely different in general. It will be every man for himself. No one will be interested in the opinion of Viktor Orban, because it will remain as a standalone, so to speak. A fragment of the world of the past. European voters will understand that they either vote for politicians who support this European solidarity, or find themselves in complete isolation and defenseless in front of Moscow. Another time will come. More complex and far more terrible. But can we talk about the fact that Ukraine now has the opportunity to become one of the leading countries in this new European world? Because, well, it's not a secret. Everyone understands that the only army that can be restrained in Europe now is the Russian armed forces. Ukraine will become exactly the same fortress of this European world. It is important to understand who will become the fortress of this European world on the borders with the United States of America. Strange as it may sound. Well, we will continue to monitor developments. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us on the air today. Until the next meeting. All the best to you. Good luck, Vadim.